5. Development of premises. These fundamental premises imply a series of consequences I should like to develop briefly. 1. Faith is anchored in what Jesus and the saints see. Jesus, he who knows God directly, sees him. This is why he is the true mediator between God and man. His human act of seeing the divine reality is the source of light for all men. Nevertheless, we must not regard Jesus himself as one totally isolated, pushing him back into a remote historical past. We have already spoken of Abraham. Let us now add that the light of Jesus is reflected in the saints and shines out through them. But the saints are not only those persons who have been explicitly canonized. There are always hidden saints, too, who receive in their communion with Jesus a ray of his splendor, a concrete and real experience of God. To spell out what this fact means, we can perhaps take up a mysterious expression that the Old Testament uses when it tells the story of Moses. Even if it is not possible to see him fully face to face, he nevertheless sees God, for he sees at least his back. And just as Moses' face shone after this encounter with God, so the light of Jesus shines forth through the life of these men. St. Thomas Aquinas begins with this affirmation in his demonstration of the scientific character of theology. We should note that, according to Aristotle, all the sciences are interrelated within a system of reciprocal explanation and dependence. None of the sciences demonstrates or reflects everything. Each of them, in one way or another, presupposes justifications that it originally draws from some other science. For Aristotle, there is only one science that penetrates to the genuine foundations of all human knowledge, and this is why he calls it the first philosophy. All the other sciences presuppose at least this fundamental reflection, and are therefore scientiae subalternatae, subaltern sciences constructed on one or more other sciences. St. Thomas inserts his explanation of theology into this general theory of science. He says that, in this sense, theology too is a subaltern science that does not see, nor does theology itself examine its own ultimate foundations. It depends on the science of the saints, on what they see. Their act of seeing is the reference point of theological thinking and the guarantee of its legitimacy. It follows that the work of the theologian is secondary with regard to the real experience of the saints. Without this reference point, without the deep anchoring in such an experience, his work becomes detached from reality. This is the humility demanded of the theologian. Without the realism of the saints, without their contact with the reality of which theology speaks, it degenerates into an empty intellectual game, and also loses its scientific character. 2. The verification of faith in life. When we put our confidence in what Jesus sees and believe in his word, we are not in fact moving around in total darkness. The good news of Jesus corresponds to an interior expectation in our heart. It corresponds to an internal light in our being that reaches out to the truth of God. Certainly we are before all else believers at second hand. But St. Thomas is right to describe faith as a process, as an interior path, when he writes, "The light of faith leads us to see." In his Gospel, St. John draws our attention several times to this process. For example, in the episode of the Samaritan woman, who relates what happened to her when she met Jesus, and how she recognized in him the Messiah. The Savior discloses to her the path of God, and then introduces her to the knowledge of him which is the source of life. The fact that it is precisely this woman who says this compels the people in her village to listen to her words. They believe in Jesus because of the woman. That is, they believe at second hand. Nevertheless, they invite Jesus to stay with them, and so enter into dialogue with him. And at the end, they can tell the woman, "It is no longer because of your words that we believe, for we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this is indeed the Savior of the world." In the living encounter, faith is transformed into knowledge. It would of course be wrong to imagine the subsequent path of faith as a linear process, as an untrammeled development. Since this path is linked to our life with all its ups and downs, we keep experiencing setbacks that oblige us to start anew. Every phase of life has to discover its own specific maturity, for otherwise we fall back into the corresponding immaturity. And yet, we can say that the life of faith also permits the growth of an evidential character of the faith. Its reality touches us, and the experience of a successful life of faith assures us that Jesus is truly the Savior of the world. Here, the second aspect we have just evoked joins the first aspect. In the New Testament, the word saints designated Christians as a whole, who certainly did not possess all the qualities that are required in a canonized saint. But this designation expressed the fact that all were called, in virtue of their experience of the risen Lord, to become a point of reference for others, thus putting them in contact with Jesus' act of seeing the living God. This remains true even today. A believer who allows himself to be formed and guided by the Church's faith, no matter what his weaknesses and difficulties may be, ought to be a window opened onto the light of the living God. And if he genuinely believes, that is what he is. The believer ought to be a force of opposition to the powers that keep the truth a prisoner, and to the wall of prejudices that prevents people from seeing God. A faith that is still inchoate ought in some way to find support in him. Just as the Samaritan woman became a living invitation to meet Jesus, so too, in the darkness of a world that is largely opposed to God, the faith of believers is an essential reference point in the search for God. 3. Faith's I, you, and we. The mediatory intervention of Jesus and that of the saints, which derives from his, converge in a third reflection. The act of faith is an eminently personal act, anchored in the most intimate depths of the human I. But precisely by being so personal, it is at the same time an act of communication. In the depths of its nature, the I is always linked to the you, and vice versa. An authentic relationship that becomes communication can be born only from the depths of the person. We have said that believing means sharing in what Jesus sees, relying on Jesus. St. John, who leans on the breast of Jesus at the Last Supper, is a symbol of what faith as such signifies. To believe is to communicate with Jesus, freeing oneself thereby from the repression that is contrary to the truth, freeing my own I, which is shut up in its own self, and making my I a response to the Father, a response to the yes of love, the yes pronounced over our existence, that yes which is our redemption and which overcomes the world. In its most intimate nature, faith is therefore a way of being with someone, of shattering that isolation of my I, which is also its malady. The faith opens out onto the distant horizon, breaking down the barriers of my subjectivity. It is this that Paul describes when he says, "It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me." The I, dissolved, rediscovers itself in a new and larger I. Paul describes this process whereby the first I dissolves and wakes up in a larger I as a rebirth. In this new I, in which liberating faith immerses me, I do not, however, discover that I am united only to Jesus. I am united likewise to all those who have walked along the same path. In other words, faith is necessarily an ecclesial act. It lives and moves in the we of the church, since it makes us one with the I communion of Jesus Christ. In this new subject, the wall separating myself and the others collapses, the wall that separates my subjectivity from the external world and makes it inaccessible to me, the wall between me and the depths of being. In this new subject, I become a contemporary of Jesus, and all the experiences of the church belong to me. They have become my own experiences. Naturally, this new birth is not the work of an instant. It lasts throughout the whole course of my life. The essential point here is that I cannot construct my own personal faith in a private dialogue with Jesus. If faith does not live in this we, it does not live at all. It is impossible to separate faith and life, or truth and life, I and we. It is only within an existence lived in the we of believers, in the we of the church, that faith unfolds its own logic and takes on its own organic form. Let us sum up. As in the questions of every day, so too in our relationship with God, we can find a path forward only by sharing in the knowledge of others. In our relationship with God, those who see and those who experience are present, and we can rely on them in our own faith. In some way they bestow their own certainty on us. We make up the multitude, but we are not simply blind vis-à-vis God. Relying on those who see, we advance gradually toward Him, and the buried memory of God, which is written on the heart of every man, awakens more and more to life in the depths of our own being. When we live close to God, our sight is restored. When we use our eyes, they bear witness to His truth. Pascal's advice to his friend may seem skeptical, but it is correct. Begin with the folly of faith, and you will attain knowledge. This folly is wisdom. This folly is the path of truth. Cardinal Ratzinger gave this lecture at the School of Catholic Culture in Santa Croce in Bassano.